Hello and welcome back to my channel. I wanted to talk about more philosophy, so that's what I'm going to do. What specifically? Skepticism. So why skepticism? If you didn't know, I'm a pretty non-religious guy. I don't really believe in God. So oftentimes when I've had conversations with people who do believe in God, religious people, theists and the like, they've often thrown at me that if you have a very skeptical mindset, or if you engage in skepticism, basically, it means that you basically have no worldview. And I think this is pretty dumb, but I've been analyzing it in as many perspectives as I can see, and I guess I sort of see why some religious people would say that skepticism doesn't count as a worldview. I mean, I don't. But at the very least, it opened up the part in epistemology that is a very, interesting topic in and of itself. So basically, why do people say skepticism doesn't count as a worldview? Or, yeah, if you are very skeptic, then essentially, you have no perspectives, supposedly. As if saying, I don't know, isn't a perspective. Okay, this vape doesn't have a perspective. Is this vape a skeptic? No, the only skeptic that can be here is me, this person, talking right now. So in that sense, I think skepticism obviously very much is, a worldview, a philosophy, in a sense. But basically, why is it that they say this then? Why would they say that if you're a skeptic, basically you have no worldview? And I would say this is pretty much the whole conversation about coherentism versus foundationalism. Now, if you say that skepticism isn't a worldview, I think it very much takes from a very foundationalist sort of perspective, and that's because people who are religious, oftentimes people that believe in God, think that in order to believe that there is any sort of truth, you need a foundation, and they would wrap that foundation up in God, basically. They don't really respect a coherentist sort of mindset, because if you're a coherentist, everything in the system has to hold up together. So this belief sorts this belief sorts that belief, and it all holds up to some sort of structure. But that's where skepticism admittedly can start poking holes. And sure, maybe we can reach a point where we just say, oh, there is no such thing as knowledge, basically. I do have a video about epistemological nihilism, so you can check that out, if you'd like. But I guess when I'm making this video, I kind of want to share, I guess, why I believe more so in coherentism, and why I would identify more as a coherentist rather than believing in foundationalism, or identify myself as basically, a foundationalist. Because when I look into foundationalism, honestly, it literally looks like a house of cards. If you strictly believed in a foundationalist sort of point of view, if you have a very foundationalist sort of mindset, then you would genuinely believe that magic is real. When magicians, perform magic, the saying is often, oh, a magician never reveals his secret. So, why wouldn't a magician reveal, his secret? Well, if he did, there would be no more fun in the trick. The illusion would not be there. And I think when people talk about God as a way of sort of a foundation, they're basically putting on a show, but they refuse to have any sort of tell about it. Now, if you have a more coherentist approach, you break things down. And sure, this will inevitably make you more skeptical towards religious points of view, because you're oh, how does that add to that? How does that add to whatever? It basically destroys the foundation of using God as a crutch. And it's really dumb to me that people think that God is a sort of crutch where you can activate based on oh, moral knowledge or epistemological knowledge, or just your any sort of knowledge whatsoever. God is often defined as a, omniscient being. So, he would know everything. So I more so see God defenders as no different than the people that are going, oh, we want the nerdy guy on our team. We want the nerdy guy on our trivia team because that's going to benefit and help us out a lot. So ironically, that foundation requires just enough doubt, just enough lack of knowledge, just enough, you can say, skepticism in order to function. Because who are you to say that you're above God, right? So if you remove God from the entire thing, all that's left is the skepticism, inevitably. So if all that's left is the skepticism inevitably, then I think you're gonna have to admit that basically you're just skeptical of your own skepticism. If skepticism wasn't a worldview, then how exactly are we talking about it to begin with? So if you say that skepticism means that there's no foundation, I would simply ask, what exactly is there no of to begin with? And that's also another layer of irony towards that whole thing. So another way that I would actually define skepticism better is that it's not necessarily that there's no foundation, there isn't anything. It's more so asking, how do you know what you know? And if there are certain questions that you're not allowed to ask in a worldview, due to this very like foundationalist sort of like setup, due to this notion of like, oh, how dare you would think that you know more than God, then it's not more so that there's no foundation. You are kind of just running away from questions that you refuse to answer, and yet front that you have such a strong foundation. So skepticism to me is a very like questioning thing, and the pursuit of knowledge starts with a question, right?